when you work in history, when you do this kind of research, for most people, certainly for me, there gets to be a point where you have to write it up. The only way you can find out what you know and what you think is to start writing, because it forces you. You start writing a sentence, blah, 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 and then you realize you don't know what the sentence, you're trying to say something, but you're not sure. Then you have to go find it out. It's the way to make whatever random or not random, whatever, all that wad of information. It's the only way to put it together in a useful manner. Because, once I knew it, I did it because I wanted the information. I think somebody else wants this information. Here's the way to let them have at it. You have to write it up. There's a big difference between African Americans in Vermont and the rest of the country. Well, maybe not the rest of the country, but a lot of the rest of the country. If you study Black history, 19th century Black history in America, it's an urban story. It is almost exclusively urban. In the North, I'm talking about the North. It's almost exclusively urban. Freed people moved to cities. People who moved around congregated in cities, and for very good reasons. I mean, there were communities of color there were churches there was more opportunity for employment there. There were also problems. I mean, urban poverty, violence, other issues. So the African Americans who moved to Vermont, some of the early people came right after the American Revolution. Some folks who had served in the American Revolution saw this part of the country and decided afterwards to move here. Vermont was late to the history of the United States. It wasn't a colony. It didn't become part of the Union until 1791, until the Revolution was over. So land was cheap. It was a place you could come. It was really a magnet at that time period for people who wanted to acquire land and get a footing. So a lot of those people came at that time, and their experience in Vermont was unlike the urban experience. There were very few of them, so they were isolated, and I think, God, they must have been so lonely, like one Black family in town, or worse, one child in a white household in a town. But there were a few little clusters. Historians talk about the Black community. In an urban area, they sort of define the Black community by, are there enough people to have a Black church, some kind of a mutual aid society, is there some kind of organizing within the group? That was never going to happen in Vermont. But there were places where there were small groups. Heinsberg is the one there's an entire book about the cluster of farmers in Heinsberg, but there was a cluster in Charlotte. Virgins had quite a few Black families. There was one large family, their extended, the Storms family. The Primus and Pamelia had 8 children, and they mostly stayed in the immediate area. So there were 4 or 5 of them living, nearby, but they were all part of one family. So what I tried to do was see, how these two experiences compared. So a major difference was these rural Black folks were able to buy land. I think more than half of the families I was tracing owned property by the 1850 census. In an urban area, I don't know, I couldn't say what the percentage is, but nothing like half the African Americans in New York City own property. They were lucky to make their rent. Over time, they tended not to hang on to their property. Again, the cluster in Heinsberg was the one that lasted the longest. The one in Charlotte was quite short-lived. The succeeding generations did not stay in Vermont. And that's something I was never able to figure out why. I don't really understand it, except that, the logical reason, why does anyone move? Better opportunity somewhere else. So they believed there was better opportunity somewhere else, or better something somewhere else. But the fact that of these folks being able to acquire small farms, small holdings, and sustain themselves that was not something I was necessarily expecting to find.